What's up everyone, Justin here. I don't have a clever intro, I just read a book and now I really want to talk about it. So, last year I took a look at Abigail Schreier's book Irreversible Damage, the transgender craze seducing our daughters, and I was not a fan. The publisher's description of that book reads as such: unsuspecting parents are awakening to find their daughters in thrall to hip trans YouTube stars and gender-affirming educators and therapists who push life-changing interventions on young girls, including medically unnecessary double mastectomies and puberty blockers that can cause permanent infertility. Coming out as transgender immediately boosts these girls' social status, Schreier finds, but once they take the first steps of transition, it's not easy to walk back. She offers urgently needed advice about how parents can protect their daughters. A generation of girls is at risk. Abigail Schreier's essential book will help you understand what the trans craze is and how you can inoculate your child against it, or how to retrieve her from this dangerous path. The cover showed a little cartoon girl with a hole through her middle. The content of the book never had to be well-researched or convincing because that was never the point. It was a book that pissed off trans people and to disingenuous hucksters like Dennis Prager and Ben Shapiro and Ray Blanchard. That made it good, so they promoted the hell out of it. It was a signifier of your stance in a culture war, far more than an honest attempt at informing you about a topic, and it made the rounds. Anyway, today we're talking about a book called Unsporting: How Trans Activism and Science Denial Are Destroying Sport. The cover features a muscular, dark-skinned person with pink hair holding a trophy while two dejected women sulk in the shadows. The book's website reads, "Radical gender activists are using a pseudo-scientific theory of human biology to hijack sports and subvert the long-established concept of fair play, forcing women and girls to risk their safety, pushing them aside for male athletes using the excuse of inclusivity. Tackling issues few have the courage to say out loud, Unsporting shows the harm inflicted on female athletes and identifies the institutions driving this movement. What does the future hold for sports if biological reality is ignored? Blade answers that question and concludes with a reasonable plan to reverse course." Linda, Barbara, I need to see you after class. And, much like the book they're copying, they apparently see no irony in attacking the political bias of their enemies while proudly displaying their own. The book is published by Rebel News Network, a far-right Canadian media outlet best known for its bedrock of anti-immigration and Islamophobic content, as well as sending white supremacists to cover the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. The blurb at the beginning of this book states that Rebel News is a leading independent source of news, opinion, and activism. So the authors, by being published by this company, are fine with activism from far-right figures. In fact, it would be accurate to say that they are activists being published by a far-right media corporation. One of the authors, Barbara Kay, should feel right at home then, since she writes for QAnon rag The Epoch Times and everyone's second favorite skull-measuring magazine, The Post-Millennial. She spends her days on Twitter complaining about the prefix cis because norms don't require a modifier, and accusing Google of conspiracies because image searching for straight white couples yields gay and non-white people. She might be interested to learn that since when straight white couples post pictures, they usually don't put their sexuality or race, Google's search algorithm doesn't pick it up. So yeah, Barbara, maybe we do need words to modify the norm. You know, like straight and white. But at least her co-author, Linda Blade, actually has some qualifications. She has 25 years of experience as a sports performance coach and a PhD in kinesiology, which is the study of human movement. It's hard to imagine better credentials for someone wanting to talk about different bodies in sport, and they list a ton of references in the back of the book that they also put up on the website. I did my best to count them up, and out of the roughly 200 references they give, only 15 are either peer-reviewed studies, dissertations, or direct data, like sports records and such. And some of them don't really count. Less than 10% of the references selected by the lead author, chosen for her expertise on this topic, are actual scientific references, with the rest of them being news and opinion pieces, most of them from right-wing sources. YouTube videos, including PragerU, and tweets. 11 of these references are tweets. Anyone expecting a real look into the science and reasoning of the topic is not going to get it and really should have known better. But I already set up the camera, and I like holding this microphone, so we're going to talk about it anyway, starting with the introduction. The very first lines are a quote from 1984 because apparently once they got the outline from Schreier's book, a bot just filled out the rest. They go over a very brief history of the Olympics, particularly how it went from only allowing men to compete to getting more and more female athletes involved over the decades. However, then something strange happened. Beginning in 1996, a new ideology that focused on gender identity as opposed to biological sex began to spread through the Olympics governing body, proposing rules and regulations that defied both biology and common sense. This ideology, a blend of social justice and gender ideology, asserts that physical differences between the sexes are not based in physical reality, but in the mind. This is, of course, nonsense. The separation of sex and gender is pretty foundational in trans activism, and no advocate for trans inclusion in sports thinks anything close to their characterization. Don't worry, though, they write, "It should go without saying that neither I nor my writing collaborator Barbara Kay is transphobic, but nothing today goes without saying when it comes to the highly charged, often politically weaponized subject of gender," right before saying how brave they are for speaking out against the trans activists. Specifically, they warn that the minds most likely to blow up are the assertions that 1. Sex is dimorphic, there are 2 sexes, and 2. A male may identify as a woman and a female may identify as a man, but to self-identify as something is not the same as being something. The first point there is an example of their larger position on trans people interfering with the wedge issue they're covering. If there are only 2 binary sexes, and those binary sexes are determined by what gametes you produce, then unless you're playing some very unique gamete-centric sports, this distinction is pretty useless. Power, speed, size, musculature. Outside of training, these are the result of other sex characteristics, primarily hormones, which means the bimodal sex spectrum is far more useful and accurate. When they say trans activists are denying science, what they mean is that trans activists are not adhering to a narrow definition of a word we've sought out for political purposes in situations where it has no utility. The words man and woman, and indeed the concept of sex, were around long before the discovery of gametes or chromosomes, and using definitions for those words outside of reproductive biology is not the same thing as denying gametes or chromosomes exist. Because body parts can change, tissue can grow or shrink or be added or removed, hormone levels can rise or fall, surgeries can be performed. Therefore, none of that stuff is allowed to determine sex because it is politically important to these authors that gender be the same thing as sex, and sex to be binary and immutable. This means they believe that trans people who assert that they are in fact who they say they are engaging in unscientific and magical thinking, a sort of gender mysticism. This is why they refer to them not as trans people, but trans-identified people, just like Schreier did, because they believe trans people can only ever be confused or lying. After bringing up George Orwell's doublethink again, they lament about how trans activists weaponize the label of transphobic to silence anyone who opposes their claims. For example, they've deplatformed speakers such as outspoken feminist Meghan Murphy, seen here via their provided reference, not being deplatformed and instead speaking at the event in question. They've also maligned and silenced important authors like Abigail Schreier and Deborah Soh by criticizing them after they appeared on the biggest podcast in the entire goddamn world. "We are silenced!" they scream from their provided podiums. They do get something incredibly right, though, warning that no matter how informative, rational, and persuasive their little book is, a small but aggressive choir of activists will inform the public that it was the work of socially retrograde conspirators blowing dog whistles to hateful far-right transphobes. Which, damn, called it, kudos. I don't think pointing out how bigoted everyone's going to find your book is making the argument you think it is, but you were correct, technically. The introduction ends with 2 notes, one encouraging readers to search the names and images of the transgender athletes mentioned in this book for context, and one letting the reader know that for the purposes of clarity, distinction, and respect, they will use the following chart to determine pronoun usage, where trans people are referred to by their preferred pronouns with an asterisk. Yeah, I know it's a caret, and yes, I did just look up what the little up arrow on the 6 key is called, but come on, that's how it's being used. Okay, see, so they were talking about dog whistles earlier, and I don't have a regular whistle, so this is a meta. Chapter 1 is called Fracture Her Skull. We begin with Linda Blade being sent a tweet from ex-MMA fighter Fallon Fox. The tweet was reacting to an allegedly non-inclusive comment by J.K. Rowling, which, if you don't know what that's referring to, check out this video on the topic, in which she said, "For the record, I knocked 2 women out. One woman's skull was fractured, the other not. And just so you know, I enjoyed it. See, I love smacking up TEFs, trans-exclusionary feminists, in the cage who talk transphobic nonsense. It's bliss, don't be mad." This was followed by 2 emojis, one winking, another a kiss. This was apparently a violent threat, not unlike the legion of like comments from trans activists attacking those they accuse of intolerance. Two problems here. One, no, it wasn't. Fox was a fighter. They punch people, and sometimes they talk smack about how they punch people. And sometimes the fans of the sport where you punch people talk about how glad they were to see someone get punched if they were a jerk. And second, the tweet she chose to reference not only misgenders Fox, but uses a fake picture. Content warning for violence. 3, 2, 1. This person intentionally used a pretty graphic picture of a bloodied female MMA fighter beside a smiling, thumbs-up-giving Fox. But the bloodied fighter is Kay Hansen, and the picture was taken at her fight against Cal Schwartz, which is, and this is true, a different person. They have referenced something that contains a lie designed to make people angry. And do you know what's funny? Cal Schwartz, who did the bloodying, is a cis woman, and it turns out that in a sport where you're supposed to kick your opponent in the head as hard as you can, people often get hurt. If you don't think cis women can be this strong and violent, you might be the misogynist. When the author of that tweet was called out in that thread for using a fake picture, she admitted that it wasn't hers and that she just spread the lie because it fed the narrative she wanted to push. This kind of makes their next argument about trans women gaslighting the populace fall flat, especially when they take a joke made by a supportive teammate about an athlete hypothetically being strong enough to injure people as hard evidence that she has in fact injured people. How droll indeed. Fuck uses droll in 2021. That's the end of chapter 1, them literally using lies as evidence to support their argument that trans women lie so they can intentionally hurt cis women. Next chapter. Chapter 2, Ethical Mirage. This chapter starts by recounting the doping scandal of Canadian sprinter Ben Johnson, who tested positive for anabolic steroids after his gold medal performance in the 1988 Olympic 100 meter, and how Linda Blade knew all along. That's it. She uses her supposed knowledge, which is literally just hearsay, she doesn't give sources, of how organizations are willing to lie about cheating until they get caught to show that a trans-inclusive policy for competition is the same thing. That's the chapter. And it's not important for this video, but it's important to me. She claims that the second place athlete in that race, and eventual gold medal winner Carl Lewis, tested positive later, insinuating he tested positive for steroids like Ben Johnson, when in reality he tested positive for common stimulants found in cold medicines, which could still be cheating, but it's either dishonest or sloppy to word it like that.
USA! USA!
Chapter 3, and I can't believe I'm reading this out loud, is titled Zuby Strikes Gold. The thesis of this chapter is that a man going by Zuby, a failed rapper from the UK, shot to fame when he posted a video of him deadlifting with the text, "I keep hearing about how biological men don't have any physical strength advantage over women in 2019, so watch me destroy the British women's deadlift record without trying. P.S. I identified as a woman whilst lifting the weight. Don't be a bigot." That was my British accent. This tweet, in which he pretends that people are saying that biological men don't have any physical strength advantage over women, and that the debate is about men who suddenly declare themselves women with no strength or mass-destroying hormone therapy whatsoever entering competitions against cis women, launched him to fame. After 10 years of pounding the pavement, hawking his merch, and shitty music, Zuby increased his followers tenfold after posting lazy transphobic nonsense. And they write this not 20 pages after they pretended that everyone was too scared of censorship to go against gender ideology. It launched his role as a social influencer into the cultural stratosphere, even earning a personal invite to the White House. Why would you include that when a big crux of your argument is that 1984-style doublespeak is silencing dissent? This chapter, in a book written by someone with a doctorate in kinesiology, was devoted to how a shitty tweet from a loser totally owned the libs. Not only that, she uses Zuby's tweet to illustrate what they want you to believe trans athletes are doing. Just waking up one day, deciding to identify as a woman, and then winning with no effort. They even provide a resource listing the growing number of male athletes enjoying success against female competitors from SaveWomenSports.com, a website that promises, no, we're a nonpartisan coalition. We just happen to exclusively recommend right-wing resources that get lots of funding from right-wing think tanks. No joke, the 3 books recommended are, of course, Irreversible Damage, When Harry Became Sally, which I've also gone over in my second video ever and is also shockingly terrible, and and a fictional story about how a group of 9 talented high school boys basketball players took advantage of a loophole in political correctness to dominate women's basketball. What level of brain rot do you have to reach to make up a fictional scenario and think it proves your point? Oh, wait. The list, by the way, is just one of trans women sometimes competing in sport. That's it. Some of them win sometimes, yes, but the vast majority of women on this list are there simply because they compete, or failing that, have said that they would like to compete. Assuming they have any links at all. Oh, Chris Bruce wants to compete in women's bodybuilding. I guess we'll take your word for it. They also list things like a ballerina, which, not to take away from the physical demands and athletic skill of dance, but that's not a sport. Why would you put that? And here's Janae Kroc, who you might remember was the victim of a shitty Blair White video about trans people in sport, and who does not compete in anything. She used to be an accomplished bodybuilder and powerlifter, and then transitioned, and now does not compete. But that doesn't matter. The reason Blair White used her and why she's on this list is because she's big and muscular, and as we've already seen, they know they can get away with lying. Chapter 4, Exemption from Reason. This chapter is a hit piece against Dr. Veronica Ivy. It is vindictive and petty, and because of this, they somehow managed to drop their standards even lower. They gleefully show a transcript from a video ascribing motivations to Ivy that are cartoonishly evil, and then they say that the authors of the video are probably right. A cowardly way to insult someone while hiding behind the thinnest veneer of plausible deniability. They rebuke arguments that are either never made by Ivy or are interpreted in the most hyperbolically dishonest way possible, including referencing a Pink news article about trans athletes to show that trans women dominate while trans men can't compete. One of these athletes, Chris Maussier, is described in the book as never winning against males at the top levels. Couple things. Chris Maussier is an endurance athlete whose competitions sometimes involve hundreds of other competitors, meaning that for that statement to be true, he would have to place last in all of his races since transitioning, never winning against males, which is obviously not true. You don't qualify for Team USA 6 times by never winning. Also, he's a 2-time national champion. There's no way you can miss that if you simply Googled the man's name. But here they are just fucking lying, I guess, because their arguments are exempt from reason. Got him! The authors even include a long section from Dr. Ivy's annual evaluation at the college she teaches at, which is kind of weird, right? Like that has nothing to do with sport. And as evaluations do, it points out some areas of improvement that need to be addressed, which is characterized as a devastating rebuke, a failing grade in Ivy's area of expertise, philosophical argument. That failing grade on the evaluation being very good. I guess standards are tougher these days. The chapter ends with a paragraph taking one final shot at Ivy with the sneering condescension of a pretentious YouTuber who thinks he's scored a huge dunk. I should work on that. Pointing out that her dissertation was titled Reasonable Assertions on Norms of Assertion and Why You Don't Need to Know What You're Talking About. It's 274 pages long and made in a field to which I do not belong, but the best I can tell from the abstract is that she's arguing that whether or not something is true is different from how well something is argued, which all of us on every side of this issue should be able to agree with. Chapter 5, The Inverse, is a short one and mostly revolves around the case of Mac Beggs, a trans boy who was forced to compete with girls in his Texas high school wrestling league. Rather than acknowledging that the exact policies the authors are pushing for caused the problem in the first place, they pretended that Texas school athletics authorities were simply worried about the poor female getting injured, which is absolutely not the case. To further show the challenges and problems with trans men in sport, the authors bring up the case of Canadian soccer player Quinn, a natal female who came out as trans last year, but still gets to compete on the women's team? The authors speculate on whether or not they will decide to go through with taking testosterone in pursuit of living as a man. There are a few things wrong with this. Quinn has stated that Quinn is their full name, and has requested publications stop using their 3-word birth name, which makes this sentence dead naming. Also, and if you know the bare minimum about trans issues, you've probably guessed by how I worded that previous sentence, Quinn is not a trans man. They came out as non-binary. The authors know so little about trans topics that they apparently did not know non-binary was a thing, and are so adamantly against learning that they will do no research whatsoever. Seriously, non-binary doesn't show up once in this book about trans people. Their source for Quinn coming out is this and no shade to Edge Media Network or anything, anemic article that does not say that they came out as a trans man. It was a lazy assumption made by the authors so they could make gross speculations about what another person might do with their body, as they failed to prove a point. Quinn, by the way, first openly trans athlete to win an Olympic gold medal. And there's your hit of positivity for the video. That's about it, but this chapter contains my favorite line in the entire book, which unintentionally makes the case an actual qualified person would use to refute it. Clearly, a sports policy that recognizes biological sex but disregards the factor of hormone therapy fails to ensure a level playing field. Yeah, you think? Chapter 6, Canadian Subterfuge, starts by once again gushing over very important book, Irreversible Damage, and then going with the ever-popular tactic of describing your opponent's arguments poorly before highlighting how confusing their own poor description was. This is why that previous line about hormone therapy is so important. It's only ever a factor when it's convenient for them. In order to make the case that cis women have to accept trans women, but cis men never have to worry, they bring up the story of two hockey players. A trans man who elected to forego hormone therapy so he could continue to compete in the women's league before retiring, and a trans woman who underwent hormone replacement therapy for 4 years before being drafted into the women's league. In one of the few instances of the authors using actual scientific research, they use a 2019 study to imply two things: that trans women's muscle strength isn't meaningfully affected by HRT, and that nothing else important for the sport is either. I've actually gone over this particular study as part of a larger critique of the Hilton Lundberg paper in a huge video I've done on the science of allowing trans women in sports, so if you want a meticulously researched video with more than 60 cited studies, I've linked to it up here in the corner and in the description, but I'll go over the basics here. The vast majority of the strength difference between cis women, and trans men came down to height. Taller people usually have more absolute strength than shorter people because they have to carry more muscle on their larger frame. You'll notice that the trans women had less strength and muscle mass than the cis men, which means you can't assume trans women are a representative sample of biological males. When they normalized for height, the difference between trans and cis women was drastically reduced. Not only that, but none of the participants in the study were exercising, which someone with a basic understanding of exercise science would know is probably why the trans men in the study didn't gain much strength or muscle. That might be nitpicking the nuances of a study, but this next line is just a straight-up lie. And I'm calling it a lie rather than an oversight, because you do not pass your entry-level physiology courses in undergrad without knowing how hormones affect muscle mass and hemoglobin. To further illustrate how little HRT does to mitigate the gap between males and females, Blade rebukes a trans hockey player, saying that her weightlifting numbers have dropped significantly back to the levels they were when she was a teenager, by pointing to the fact that the world record for a 15-year-old sprinter is better than the elite female record. Those are different sports, Linda. The record for the 15-year-old sprinter wouldn't even be good enough for last place in the Olympics, therefore a 15-year-old gymnast would have no chance. This chapter, by my earlier count, has the most studies and data of any chapter, but it still spends the bulk of its length recounting anecdotes and going to turf websites to find one roller derby player willing to talk about how hard it was for her community to reject her for being a bigot. Which, that's weird, right? If women are being silenced into forcing male bodies to compete no matter how unfair it is, why would you be bringing up how your fellow female athletes and leagues rejected your bigotry? Sort of goes against your own point when women disagree with you the most. All of this to make a "we were never asked" argument. Which, sorry, no, just because you didn't look up the rules doesn't mean they were put there by stealth. After some fear-mongering about how letting trans girls compete in sports will lead to more women getting breast cancer, we trail off into a teaser for the conspiracy theories of the next chapter. Who are the proponents of this unfairness within Canada's sports establishment? The answers may surprise you. Chapter 7, Olympic Capitulation, begins with Linda Blade letting us all know that in 2018, 2 months after she had her revelation about the dangers of self-ID in sport, she was going to spend the entirety of her 5-minute candidacy speech for president of the Athletics Alberta Board decrying gender self-identification, particularly how Bill C-16 had set all of this in motion. Yeah, remember Bill C-16? That amendment to Canada's Human Rights Act which simply put gender identity and expression under their list of protected classes? Yeah, she's one of those people, complete with unfounded concerns about locker rooms, showers, and bathrooms. "This is the hill I will die on," she said. And it worked. She won re-election with 96% of the vote. She even does what all of these books do and let us know that a person who identifies as LGBTQ totally agrees with her. So that almost definitely means lesbian or bisexual. You don't identify as LGBTQ. Those letters don't all mean the same thing unless you like the umbrella definition of queer. And if the woman was a T, Blade would have jumped at the chance to let us know. These books keep insisting that being gay and being trans are worlds apart, and that supporting one doesn't mean you have to support the other, while at the same time using supporting or identifying as LGB as a shield against accusations of transphobia. Anyway, this LGBTQ identified person was shocked that the 2015 International Olympic Committee guidelines for trans athletes stipulated that an athlete must demonstrate that her total serum testosterone levels have been below 10 nanomoles per liter for at least a year before she's allowed to compete as a woman. Now, Blade correctly points out that this is much higher than the average cis woman's T levels, which range from 0.52 to 2.4 nanomoles per liter. What she incorrectly posits is that this level was set to accommodate trans women. It was not. This number was introduced by the International Association of Athletics Federations in 2011 to accommodate cis women with above average levels of testosterone. It turns out that it's always been more difficult than transphobes make it out to be to determine who counts as female in female sports. Blade thinks that the most significant factor is chromosomes, despite the fact that, again, other sex characteristics, primarily testosterone, are responsible for the increased strength and muscle development in men, and that XY women with androgen insensitivity syndrome have been unfairly excluded from competition in the past, despite zero scientifically demonstrable performance benefits. The designation of 10 nanomoles per liter was introduced to protect cis women, and it's being introduced here to pretend like it was designed at their expense. Blade, to her credit, does give a fairly accurate history of sex verification in sport and how chromosome verification has been usurped, but she keeps pretending like a Y chromosome is what matters when decades of testing and analysis, not some insidious trans cabal, is why we don't use it anymore. Chapters 6 and 7 are the only ones with any significant scientific references, despite, and I cannot state this enough, being written by someone with a PhD in kinesiology. But one of Chapter 7's 3 academic sources is only being presented in order to debunk. The study is Joanna Harper's paper on self-reported race times from trans athletes post-transition, which does have its problems. I wouldn't use it as the smoking gun that proves the fairness of trans women in sport. That's what this video is for, but the ways Blade tries to discredit the study are phenomenally hypocritical. First, she says Harper's study was the sole reason the IOC ruling on trans athletes was put in place, which, no, Linda, that's a lie. The people on that committee have the same or better qualifications than you and can form their own opinions much like the experts you've had opine throughout this book. Second, she really needs to let you know that Harper is trans, with an asterisk, and that means any study she does is tainted. Third, Blade questions Harper's credentials as she's a medical physicist rather than a kinesiologist or sports scientist. Later in the same chapter, Blade references the Hilton-Lundberg study in a video based on it. Dr. Emma Hilton is a biologist who also does not have a background in either kinesiology or sports science, and the author she made a video with, Zach Elliott, is an architecture student who self-publishes his diaries about being an architecture student, fiction about the high IQ lovers of architecture, and for some reason a book about gender. Notice the lack of credentials after his name on a book he's tagged as about evolutionary biology, neuroendocrinology, and neuroscience. Oh, and this is just for me, but that video somehow has fewer views than mine critiquing the same paper, so, by the laws of internet clout slinging, I'm more qualified to talk about this subject. Also have 2 degrees. Keep going, keep pushing. Chapter 8, Gatekeepers Under Scrutiny. I'm going to drink an entire bottle of my brown medicine the second I'm done filming this. This chapter sees Blade accusing the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sports of turning themselves inside out to advocate for unfair play. She claims that, based on her own observation, no effort was made to select broadly from fields of research, such as 2 American textbook authors out of nowhere. Yeah, she cites a textbook solely to postulate that maybe these 2 guys should have been consulted. And yes, that was one of the things I counted as a scientific reference when looking at their reference list before diving into the book. My professors wouldn't have let me write, well, maybe Linda Blade should have consulted Judith Butler before writing her book, and call that a scientific reference, so I'm taking that off the already paltry list. Or maybe they could have selected someone a little more qualified, someone with the right combination of academic credentials and coaching experience, someone like, Linda Blade, the true expert on the topic. Then she goes right back into this weird credentialism where she has to blatantly lie about the composition of the committee she's trying to prove is ruining female sport. Blade laments that there was no disinterested biologist on the committee because no one other than a biologist could have an informed opinion on the scientific theories. This is really strange to me. Blade isn't a biologist, and yet she claims to have valuable expertise in the discussion. I think it's because she's not writing this book for an informed scientific audience, so she can get away with pretending that biologists are experts on every aspect of life, instead of part of a general umbrella of individual specialties that may or may not be beneficial when discussing sport. It could be that she's trying to give credence and cover to Doctors Emma Hilton and Colin Wright, biologists who have absolutely zero experience in exercise science, but lots of experience as anti-trans activists, who she quotes multiple times for their expertise, with Colin even writing a puff quote at the beginning of her book. But also, Blade just straight up lies again. She says the only representative from the domain of science was a medical doctor, who you can't trust because he's not a disinterested observer. Blade proves that he is a proponent of expeditious affirmation for youthful transition, basically repeating the false assertion that doctors rush kids into surgery and hormones, by referencing an article that says the exact opposite. She repeats that he is the one single scientist on the committee, of which there were 5, including Dr. Alice Drager, who famously supported both Michael Bailey and his intensely transphobic book, The Man Who Would Be Queen, and Dr. Ray Blanchard's comically debunked taxonomy of trans women. So not only was there way more than one scientist, they weren't exactly all radical trans activists, and the other members were a mix of athletics professionals and ethicists, which seem like relevant fields to include on a committee about fairness in sport. When Blade says she sees no effort to select broadly from fields of research, she means they didn't come to the conclusion she wanted them to. Blade then spends the next third of the chapter reposting a significant chunk of an article in the Post-Millennial by her co-writer Barbara Kay, which you cannot access without paying money, and which boasts the very disinterested, neutral title, Canadian Sports Experts Embrace Misogynist Practices to Please Trans Activists, and subhead, Female athletes need to know that their coaches, managers, and associations will stand up to politically correct tyranny. We then, I guess, have to trust Kay's recounting of when she reached out to committee member Dr. Bruce Kidd, a decorated athlete and founding dean of the University of Toronto's Faculty of Kinesiology and Physical Education, with a lifetime of experience not only in sport, but specifically the Olympic movement. There's no record or transcript of this interaction included, so we're not only taking their word for what was said, but letting them explain what was actually meant. Dr. Kidd has been made an Officer of the Order of Canada for having devoted his life to eradicating sexism and racism in sporting communities around the world. And not only does Blade trust Kay to understand what an expert really means on a topic, which he has no qualifications whatsoever, but then they turn him into a quotation marks expert promoting misogyny in sport. This is what brain poisoning looks like. Is that the only possible reason for more and more sports organizations adopting trans-inclusive policies is that being called transphobic is a fate worse than death to many cultural elites? Oh my god, what do they mean by cultural elites? Now's as good a time as any to point to this article by Kay from a few months ago, in which she uses a documentary about Woody Allen as an opportunity to tell us that, while there's nothing wrong with aging men lusting after 17-year-olds, we shouldn't let that distract us from intellectuals and the LGBTQI+ movement wanting to normalize pedophilia. Chapter 9 is just Blade praising World Rugby for doing things the right way, which means they came to the conclusion she wanted, in part based on the research done by Hilton and Lundberg we've already talked about. There's nothing else interesting in this chapter other than the typical conservative glee conservatives get from a negative progressive reaction to something, so yeah, we're moving on. Chapter 10 is called Intersex Diversion, and is about Linda Blade shooting her own arguments in the foot. She says that intersex athletes are distinct from transgender athletes. And 2 pages later, she says that actually they're the same thing. She says that verbal trickery hijacked the discussion on intersex athletes to become about gender identity, in the midst of calling 46XY women biological males who merely identify as female. She says that the discussion surrounding atypical biology focuses on a minuscule section of the population, while lamenting that Olympic caliber athletes are rarely examples of typical biology. Finally, she does the classic conservative talking point of saying that ordinary, decent people agree with her, and only gender ideologues and their allies could possibly disagree, painting every scientist, athlete, and bioethicist who have dared to take a more detailed look at human performance beyond chromosomes as Orwellian double-thinkers. In a book that accuses so many people of misogyny for respecting the rights and identities of trans people, she's very quick to accuse women who are assigned female at birth and have lived and continue to live their lives as women as not only not being real women, but cheating real women out of their place on the podium. To top it all off, she asserts multiple times that these gender ideologues want to erase sex differentiation from sports altogether, with absolutely zero evidence backing that up beyond her laughable and often fictional interpretation of sport guidelines and policy. Chapter 11, we're almost through, stay with me. Charter rights for some. This one starts with a question. Don't athletes who self-identify as the opposite gender have rights that must be respected? And Linda Blade's answer is no. Okay, that might be a little unfair, but there's nothing new in this chapter. It's filler. Just her saying the same talking points she said throughout the book, including that she doesn't believe a balancing of sex and gender-based rights in sport is possible, and that everyone who doesn't want trans kids playing sports are wonderful, apolitical people who just don't understand magical gender thinking. Chapter 12, Biden skews Title IX. The broader purpose of this book is made clear in this chapter and in the conclusion, so I want to save that for later in order to talk about one line and one note. Far more pervasive have been the invisible forces of big tech and the multinational corporations aligning with trans activists. Note, Jennifer Bielik of the 11th Hour blog has written extensively on this cabal. Turns out that when you go down this route of conspiratorial thinking, you run into some problems. Now, there are two wolves inside of me. One wants to talk about how Bielik, the source Blade just referenced, endorses the conspiracy theory that sissy hypnoporn is the trans industry's golden goose, literally hypnotizing men into believing they are trans so they go on HRT and make the bigwigs lots of money. The other wolf really wants you to know that since most conspiracy theories have that buy-in factor of the elites lying to the masses to promote whatever agenda you don't like, it's usually not long until the Jews come up. What did you mean by cultural elites earlier, authors Linda Blade and Barbara Kay? Finally, thank God, we've reached the conclusion where the last lines read, "It will take relentless pressure from a critical mass of sports stakeholders and their allies to reverse the unjust and harmful train of consequences the new gender policies have set in motion. But such a resistance movement can only be effective if the people in it are fully informed of what they are up against. And that is why we wrote this book." The chapter starts by once again stating that the root cause of the confusion in sports, at least in Canada, is Bill C-16, and because she knows her audience, reminds them that Jordan Peterson and Megan Murphy, they really want you to remember Megan Murphy, came to prominence by speaking out against it. Neither of them brought up sport at that time. Their opposition was rooted in the rejection of gender ideology, of refusing to believe that trans people are who they say they are, and their rise to fame came from fear-mongering about what the bill would do, which was either putting people in prison for misgendering or putting women at risk in single-sex spaces, neither of which came to fruition. These authors, like every other ideologue and politician suddenly interested in protecting women's sport, don't only care about sport. They don't think gender identity is worthy of being a protected class. They believe trans women are men and trans men are women, and if forced to comply, they'll use an asterisk on their pronouns. They think trans activism has infiltrated and corrupted all sectors of society, threatening the rights of women in every capacity where trans women should be expected to be included. That's what this book is about. Creating straw monsters, threatening science, sanity, and fairness in the area they think will get them the best foothold in order to advance a conservative agenda against trans people. If they can convince the average person that men are just pretending to be women to win competitions, they might be able to get them to revisit the debunked idea that men are just pretending to be women to gain access to women's private spaces in order to assault them, which would be a great launching off point to convince them that trans women are really just deviant men with a fetish. Ray Blanchard is indeed thanked for his contributions to their struggle and understanding in the acknowledgments section at the end of the book, right underneath Jennifer, "Could it be the Jews?" Bielik. They want virulent transphobes who are lightly punished for violations of basic human dignity to be seen as victims, and the average trans woman to be seen as a malicious cheater, proudly stealing valor from the helpless, real women society has forgotten about. So that was Unsporting, How Trans Activism and Science Denial Are Destroying Sport. It reads like it was compiled from Grant Lineham's old tweets and spends exponentially more time attempting to garner a victim complex in its audience than it does trying to offer a cogent summary of science, which I'm guessing guessing is why the book is published by a right-wing propaganda rag and just needed a degree in at least one author's bio for window dressing. I know that this was a pretty intense video, especially if you're sensitive to bigotry, and especially knowing that dozens of bills trying to exclude trans kids from athletics have been introduced in the US alone in the past 2 years. So I wanted to end on the closest thing to a positive message that I could. These people are one note, and that note is fear. Progress is never linear, and yeah, sometimes in uncertain times, people turn to old bigotries to feel some sense of structure. But there's only so long you can keep screaming that the sky is falling before people get used to it still being there. They tried to push a garbage theory about trans people just being men with fetishes, and it's been debunked by the increased visibility of trans voices, proving them wrong for nearly as long as it's been laughed out of academia. They tried to push the narrative that men were going to start invading bathrooms and locker rooms under the guise of being trans, and that didn't happen either. They tried to scream to the heavens that New Zealand weightlifter Laurel Hubbard, the first openly transgender athlete to compete in the Olympics in their true gender category, was going to destroy the entire integrity of the games. And then she bombed out, failing a lift that the eventual gold medal winner crushed. This book and this issue is their last stand as they try to convince everyone that even though they've been wrong about everything else before, trust them, they're totally not bullshitting you this time. And considering how much bullshit was needed to pad out this book, I don't think this time will be any different. Hey y'all, thanks for making it all the way to the end of this video. It was a long one, and I appreciate your time and hope you enjoyed it. Please leave a like on the video and subscribe if you haven't already. I'm hoping to get to 10K in the next month or two. And a special thank you to the wonderful and generous people scrolling by for supporting me on Patreon, who you can join in the link in the description if you'd like to throw $1 or $2 my way.